And it takes time and it takes patience, but they're doing the job right. And that's a mentality that I think increasingly, as the tools of AI offer us the ability to do things quickly, they erode our sense of quality, right? And a sense of how to do a job, not just quickly, not just 80% well, but like 100% well. And that's the thing that makes you resilient.
Welcome to The Art of Quality, the podcast seeking wisdom in business, investing, systems, and the art of paying attention. Each episode uncovers stories from practitioners who have spent years pursuing multi-generational excellence in their craft. We are seeking to understand how the world really works and how we can align our actions to it. I am your host, John Candito, and this is our series on the art of quality in investing. Our guest today is Eric Markowitz. Eric is a partner and the director of research at investment firm Nightview Capital, and a former investigative journalist with bylines in The New Yorker, GQ, Fast Company, and other outlets. A near-death experience prompted Eric to wonder why some cultures, companies, and products dramatically outlast others. Eric is traveling the globe on a quest to answer one question: what allows a rare few systems to outlast? He has just returned from trips through Switzerland, Portugal, France, and Australia. This is the second episode in our Notes from the Field series with Eric, as he moves closer to publishing his book titled Outlast with Scribner, the flagship imprint of Simon & Schuster. Listeners will also enjoy our first episode in this series, which is linked in the episode description. Today, we discuss why practice is more important than ideas, why digging down into the work is more important than climbing the ladder to the top, and the most undervalued asset in a firm. Please enjoy our conversation with Eric Markowitz. All right, Eric, welcome back to The Art of Quality.
Thank you for having me.
So excited to do this again. This is the second time that we're discussing your fascinating journey. And so just remind, maybe for those that haven't heard the first time we did this yet, remind us of the journey you're on and why you're on it.
Yeah. At a high level, like you, I'm an investor, but several years ago, I got pretty fascinated with some of the world's oldest companies. I started thinking that there's a lot of focus and attention being paid to the companies that we admire today, the fastest growing companies, sort of the hyperscalers. And these are companies that you and I study for a living. But it struck me that there had been very little either academic or business inquiry into what has enabled some of these firms to survive, in some cases for 1,500 years. It seems kind of incredible now in a world that has become like addicted to rise and fall stories and short-term thinking that a business could last for over 1,000 years. But I started tugging at this question of where are these oldest companies? What do they do? And most importantly, how have they survived? And what can they teach us about building something and growing something that has the chance to be multi-generational and passed along to the next generation long after we're gone?
Incredible. And so I know you've been traveling the world, and something that stuck out to me from our first conversation is very early on, you realized surely there's got to be a database of these things. And as far as you're aware, there isn't. And so you've been building a database of, here are the world's oldest companies. On the first time we did this, which we'll link in the description for those interested, you had traveled through the US, you traveled through Italy, you traveled through Japan. Where have you been since we last checked in on your journey?
Yeah, so most recently I was in Switzerland, which we'll talk about because you came and met me. I was in Portugal. I was in Australia. I was in France. Thankfully, the travel is slowing down for the end of the year. It'll pick back up in the new year. But my goal is to effectively get to as many places as possible to, almost like an anthropologist, study these companies. I'm not so much looking to answer the question of, are these good companies, bad companies? I'm simply trying to understand their system, their culture, the way they think about growth, the way they think about their own endurance, the way they think about handling crises, the way they think about treating their workers, the way they think about innovation. And what I'm finding over and over is that it's pretty much the opposite of how most of modern management theory thinks. It completely upends how many Silicon Valley type folk, including myself at one point, really thought about the necessity of growth at all costs and scaling things and optimizing things. And what I'm finding, not just in European crafts or Japanese artisan workshops, but within even large organizations, there's like a different mentality that exists. And I find it absolutely inspiring and optimistic about how to create something that is not extractive, but is ultimately productive, that creates value for the entire ecosystem, not just for shareholders, not just for its owners, but for the community, for its employees, for its customers. And it's a model of business that I think I have become very drawn to on a personal level.
Yeah. In the last couple decades, we've seen the rise of triple bottom line investing and considering profit and community and environment. We've seen the rise of ESG investing and various debates on how that even should be defined. How is this different from those things? Those things both feel like things that sort of came and I don't want to say went, but sort of like rose and then maybe subsided over, call it a decade. You're talking about things that have lasted for hundreds or thousands of years. So how is this different?
So I suppose that I'll start with my own experience of those ideas, which is I think they were very good ideas. I don't think that they were practical, and I don't think that they were actually used by the people who said that they were using them. I think if you look at ESG scores, you'll find some pretty oddities in there in which, large oil companies or conglomerates are at the top of an ESG chart, which even to a layperson should kind of challenge what these ESG scores actually mean. I think that when you get beyond the sort of lingo and the impractical frameworks of quote unquote sustainability or quote unquote ESG or quote unquote DEI, and you get into actual organizations, actual people who are creating things that are on a more fundamental level sustainable, those are the systems that have the capacity to endure for decades, centuries, in some cases millennia. I think what I'm getting at that's different is those are ideas, those are theories, those are checkboxes. I'm getting more into the practice of what it looks like to actually create those real life living systems that are not just long-lived for the sake of being old, but they actually offer something valuable to the world and a sense of meaning and pride in the work that they do. And I think that's where it's really different. So on the triple bottom line and the ESG, I tend to be somewhat skeptical, if not cynical, of those approaches because they're not rooted in a larger reality, which is that if you want to create a sustainable business, we kind of need to reframe everything that we do. It's not just about carbon imprint or footprint. It's not just about what your board looks like. Those are sort of symptoms, or those are tertiary or secondary effects of some larger system that has evolved. I'm getting at something maybe a little bit deeper, which is the very nature of business itself. The things that last the longest tend to be the things that are themselves the most sustainable.
Interesting. I'm hearing a lot in there that we can pull on some of this, but one is, practice is more valuable than ideas. Culture is more valuable than games. Survival is a decent proxy for value. You're sort of delineating between the thing that looks or sounds good and the thing that is good.
Yeah.
Which is
and,
really interesting.
And you've said something to me in one of our conversations that I love, but I actually have been thinking more deeply about it. You've quoted the either NASCAR or F1 aphorism, in order to finish first, you must first finish. And I think that's true. But I think a more interesting question is, are we even in the race that we want to be competing with to begin with? Right?
Mm,
Let's just use the metaphor of the race. Yes, like the goal is to finish first, but if the race itself is not something that you're proud of, right? If it doesn't create value for the world, then what's the point in finishing first?
right.
You
Yeah.
know, you and I both spend a lot of time with investors and CEOs, and I think we both have the sense that we're around a lot of very successful people who have sort of risen to the top. They've been first, but they get to the end of their lives, and the things that they're most proud of are not the assets in their bank account or even the companies that they've built. It's like the relationships that they've fostered along the way. It's the people that they've helped. It's the people that have helped them.
Hmm.
And so I think if we're going to be finishing first, of course we need to first finish, but we first, I think, need to ask ourselves, like, what is the race that we're competing in?
Yeah. Yeah, very much. Very much. I complete coincidence. My wife and I just watched the beautiful film It's a Wonderful Life last night, which we tend to do Christmas time, every year. And of course, one of the big points in there was, the protagonist wanting to look out and go and do great things and completely missing the point that he's already done wonderful things through relationships he has in his small town. And so, yeah, game selection, or what is the race worth racing? I think there's a lot of wisdom in there. Tell
Yeah.
us some stories. So you mentioned Switzerland, Portugal, France, Australia. Start wherever you'd like, but maybe double click on cases where you've seen people kind of intentionally or thoughtfully pick the right race.
So I suppose I'll start with one little anecdote from Japan that I really loved, which was I spent time in a little shop called Kakaido, which is a tea caddy shop, and they make these little beautiful tea canisters. And if you've ever seen one, you'd instantly recognize it. It's where the top sort of floats down to the base of it because it's just hand. Every single one is handmade. It's a very small shop. There's a legend, and I think maybe somewhat backed in truth, that Steve Jobs visited the store in the 80s, and it became the inspiration for the Apple box, which is the box when you get an iPhone, the top of the box sort of floats off the top and floats down to the base if you open and close it. And I spoke with one of the craftsmen there. I also spoke with the sixth generation owner, but the craftsman was in the midst of a 10-year apprenticeship. And I just sort of was watching him hammer away with his little hammer while he made this tea caddy. And I asked him what he enjoyed about the work. I mean, this is not in our own, I suppose, modern conception of ambition. It wasn't a particularly ambitious job, right? He wasn't trying to be the CEO. He wasn't trying to start a startup. He was just trying to hammer a perfect tea caddy. And in talking to him, he said something, and I'm going to paraphrase, but, for me, this is meditation. I just love the process of doing the work and trying to get better. And that's a shop that has existed for close to 200 years. It's sought after by customers around the world. I also know for a fact that some major CEOs have visited the shop to understand their approach to quality, their approach to mastery, and even though it has stayed small intentionally, there's no intention to grow, they create something of beauty. So I thought getting into the idea of purpose and connecting it back to business and endurance, things that endure tend to have workers that find meaning in the pursuit. And I think that contrasts to how many of our peers feel about the work they do. This isn't new, by the way. One of my favorite books is Working by Studs Terkel. For people who don't know, Studs Terkel was a radio journalist, sort of an oral historian of American work. And he traveled around the country with a little microphone, and he just asked people about what they did every day. And most people just said things that you probably recognize today, like, I just feel like a cog in a machine. I'm not sure what the point is for doing all this every day. And it strikes me that there's something lost in this sort of post-industrial revolution, hyper-growth economy that continues to be lost on an even deeper level. We move faster, we send more emails, we automate things, we make things more efficient. And yet many of us have lost like a feeling of connection to the work that we do every day, to the value that we see in the world. It's very rare to come across someone who feels really deeply connected to the thing that they actually do every day, especially in modern, knowledge work, whatever that really is, people who sit at desks. It's hard to feel that connection. And it's not their fault for feeling disconnected from the work. It's the structure of business that we've created has become quite transactional and inauthentic. And to me, it explains a lot of the phenomena that we see, which is company lifespans are shorter than ever. Employee turnover is the highest it's ever been. I think one statistic I saw is people on average leave jobs after about 4 years, if not sooner. At the companies that I'm spending time with, people spend their entire lives there, right? And it's not just because they're paid well. Many of them are not paid particularly well. They're paid enough, but they feel respected and they feel like they're learning and they feel like they're in pursuit of something better. And so, I see this pattern just repeated across the travel. We saw it in Geneva in many ways, right? We saw an approach to work that was so specific, so in pursuit of perfection, that took so many years of training to achieve, making a watch, making a thing that is no longer actually necessary in this world. And yet people still pursue it and people still find value in it because it's beautiful, right? I mean, Patek Philippe, Vacheron, Rolex, yes, these are luxury watches, but their existence, to me, their continued existence implies that we all want to feel like our life matters and that we're connected to things that have beauty. And my wife and I were talking about this the other day, that, we were talking about AI and how it writes, and, there's some great pieces about this, but like in anything that's automated, any process that's fully automated, it sort of like loses something, right? It's hard to put your finger on, but it doesn't feel human. And we started talking about this, and I was looking at our kitchen. We had some artwork from her grandmother that she created, and her grandmother was an artist, and her art was imperfect, right? It wasn't the perfect picture of the Eiffel Tower that you'd get from IKEA. It was like, you could tell that there were mistakes and there were some scratches, but I like it because it was imperfect, right? And I think that's what we're trying to get at is something connected to a more human approach in both the way that we work, but also the products that we buy, the services that we transact with. Yes, you and I both study like how companies can become more efficient by using certain technologies. And in the short term, it works. But I also think that in the long term, many of these shortcuts erode the value that people actually desire, which is like a connection to another person. It's all joy in life is relational. It's about human relationships. And I know that this is a long riff, but I am quite inspired by what I've seen, and it fills me with hope. It fills me with optimism. I feel like the purpose of what I'm trying to achieve in this project is not simply to offer like a longevity hack. There's plenty of guys out there selling brain pills and, treatment programs so you can live 20 years longer. The purpose of my project is to pursue your work with such passion, and to pursue your life and building a business or growing an investment firm or just being the best email marketer in the world in a way that makes you feel really good about yourself and that you want to keep doing it for many, many years to come. And that the value that you've created is genuinely felt by the people that experience it. So I'll stop there. That's my soapbox. But that is what I've seen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we're trying to poke at, how does the world really work? What is the fabric pattern of reality? And we've talked about this before, that time is possibly the best filter we have. And so there's certainly things in the business that last hundreds of years that are not present in the businesses that, live and die within a decade. And deeply human things, to your point. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the craftsman making the tea caddy, the only reason you would do that, it's not to maximize fame or fortune. There's something in there that's just about finding beauty and truth in serving the work itself. One of my favorite essays, I'm going to read the Studs Terkel book. I haven't come across that. I love the essay by Dorothy Sayers, Why Work? And her point is, one of them is effectively we need people serving the work. And in serving the work, you actually end up serving your fellow man. And that's where you get to your point. I think of it as fingerprints on the work or imperfections. Patina is a beautiful word for that. It's the stuff of life, right? That's
I'd also
beautiful.
suggest another book. I mean, I'm not the first to notice this. I think that there's a long history of great books and writers who have struggled to articulate this. One who does it really well is, I believe his name is Matthew Walker, but the book is called Shopcraft is Soulcraft. And that's one that inspired me quite deeply. And he's given lectures that you can watch online. You know, he was a PhD from UChicago who worked as a consultant for about 6 months before leaving that world to run a motorcycle shop. And he repairs motorcycles. And so very much in the spirit of Robert Pirsig, he writes about what it feels like to fix things with your hands and how over the last 50 years or so, and certainly in the last decade, we've pushed young people into believing that in order to achieve status or wealth or success as it's defined, they need to go the other path, right? And this isn't just like lionizing a certain type of work. You know, I'm not saying it's better to be a plumber than it is to be a software engineer. I'm saying that there exists a path for people to deliver something that's truly high quality in life that doesn't fit the normal pattern that we've been sold of go to an Ivy League school and go work at Goldman or McKinsey. And I think I'm right about this because you just look at the numbers. People burn out from those jobs, right?
Or just go talk to anybody in the middle of one of those companies or who's left it. And of course, there's some people who love those existences, and that's fine. You can serve that work well too. But it's interesting, you know, try to get the exit interviews on, and not just picking on Goldman and McKinsey, but just let's just say elite knowledge work as a category. And there are at least as many people who spun out of that and went and really wanted to grow a garden or something, right? They just happened to bump into that, and they needed that to realize that wasn't the path for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and to your point, it's not a knock on these organizations. It's not a knock on any individual's choice to pursue a certain path. I think that it's just very easy to become seduced by the idea that these are the paths that lead to success and fortune and fame, when in reality, A, they're not, and B, even if you do achieve that, the feeling is not as I suppose good. When I was in Switzerland. It's at what cost, right? Like, I think that we have a lot of metaphors that are wrong. And there's one that I always just come back to, which is this idea of, I've never published this, but I gave this as a talk once, and who knows, it's a little cheesy, but bear with me. But, you know, we have this like myth of the myth of the mountain, right? Like, all we talk about in life is like climbing and reaching the top of the peak, you know, like, the idea of business is, it's a good job where you can climb the ladder and you can get to the top. And that's not what I see in my own research, right? Like, that's not the path that's pursued at these companies. It's actually the opposite. It's like going down. It's going down deeper into the work. Like, the people who are most valued at these organizations are not necessarily the C-suite. It's the people actually doing the work. Right? It's the people who are getting better at the thing the company does, not the capital allocators, which I realize sounds like heresy to folks in our crowd who lionize the capital allocators, right? Like, these people are financial geniuses. But when your company is over-engineered and over-financialized, something is inherently lost. It becomes more brittle. When it becomes purely about an extraction of profit, the entire ecosystem becomes more weak. And as an investor, I care about this because if I want to invest in a company for 30 years, I have to understand that the very nature of the organization is healthy. And I'm not looking, I'm not a trader, right? And you are not either. We want to invest in companies that we can believe can compound and improve over time. And when you get too fixated on the short-term earnings mechanics of these companies, then your entire worldview becomes focused on the wrong part of the business, becomes focused on, the cash flow and the income statement. I tend to think that company culture is the most undervalued asset a firm has. And that's not just a theory. This is coming directly from my research of talking to these firms who again and again tell me this, which is we have survived because of our culture, right? And it's not, these aren't firms that are like looking for some, inclusion on, some top 100 company to work for list. I'm not speaking to the HR people. I'm speaking to the workers. I'm speaking to the owners. I'm speaking to the customers, and they're telling me this. And it's as close of approximation to truth, and I've found it. And I think it tells us something about what we think about when we think about valuation of a company, right? You read a sell side analyst, they're not talking about company culture. They're talking about next quarter's earnings. And I find that so short-sighted. And I find it not only short-sighted, but just deeply unuseful for my purposes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you have some of the similar feelings.
But yeah, well, I'm thinking, you and I were both at the Berkshire Hathaway meeting earlier this year. And one of the things that Buffett mentioned that I found myself thinking about several days later is that he said he spends at least as much time with the balance sheet as he does the income statement. And of course, in a lot of ways, the income statement is kind of what's happening now. The balance sheet is maybe over time a little bit better approximation for what has happened and what's compounding inside the business. And then zoom out even more if there was a culture statement or something. I think, if we're laying these things out on a timeline, if you want to understand the health of the business, as you say, you can't do it without understanding the culture. A lot of businesses can look good through the numbers for a few years and be toxic places, but I'm guessing you haven't found any businesses that survived for 1,000 years and just were horrible places to spend time.
No, and that it goes back to your initial question about like ESG, sustainability. Like, well, these are the firms that have also survived are ones that haven't completely depleted resources around them or broken communities, right? They're firms that have one of the central themes through the work is this idea of the garden, which you hinted at, which is they're not machines. They're gardens that grow, and to be considered, in my own mind, what I'm looking for is it's again not just old age, but certain firms that have the unique ability to survive and age gracefully, improve with time, and improve their communities. That is a rarer breed. It's very difficult to find those businesses. There is no global database of them. I've done the work to create my own. And I think that the nature of business today often feels kind of the opposite of what these companies are doing. And I think we all feel it in our bones that everyone's, I think we're actually wired pretty well to pick up on bullshit. And we kind of know when things are just being sold to us and we're getting ripped off. Like, when was the last time you had a good interaction with your cable company or internet service provider? But you've probably had experiences where maybe you've, had a good relationship with your local contractor, your local plumber who, put in the extra work and really wanted to do the job right and didn't overcharge you on something. This is all very top of mind because we just moved into a new house that's very old and we're having, a lot of repairs done. And we're lucky to work with some like incredible craftsmen to do this work. And it takes time and it takes patience, but they're doing the job right. And that's a mentality that I think increasingly, as the tools of AI offer us the ability to do things quickly, they erode our sense of quality, right? And a sense of how to do a job, not just quickly, not just 80% well, but like 100% well. And that's the thing that makes you resilient, right?
Yeah.
So So that's a story that I've just heard repeated, and it's in some ways very obvious, right? But I do think it's rare to see it and to experience it.
Yes. Yeah, I'm thinking, of course, I'm going to relate this to power law somehow, but a pretty well-known power law is the power law on learning, which effectively states that kind of if you're taking a thing you're trying to learn, the first 50% is not that hard. And then the next 50% of the remaining 50% is not that, it's a little bit harder. And then but like learning that last 1% to go from, very good to excellent basically takes forever. And so, the world is debating, and these are good debates too. The world is debating, when will cars fully drive themselves, or when will robots be able to perform great surgery or whatever. And there's a sort of like, when can you hit a minimum standard that's needed for certain things? But then there's a very different, like when can, if ever, can the robots do something that is not just good, but also beautiful, or not just adequate, but also right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like this, to me, what's most fascinating is seeing how across the research I'm doing is how these firms integrate new technologies while really honoring the tradition. And so, we could talk about the time in Geneva, but it wasn't isolated to just the watchmakers. There's an element of if these firms do not use the newest in machines, the newest in tooling technologies, they will become uncompetitive, right? And that's true. So it's this careful dance that organizations have to do, and it's incredibly hard. But the question in everyone's mind who's leading a company or investing in companies, the question should be how to use these tools, because we have to use them, without losing the greatness that we once aspired to build our companies with. So to use an extreme example, if Hollywood's just started they decided, hey, we're not going to pay any screenwriters anymore. We're not going to pay any actors anymore. We're going to create completely AI-generated movies, scripts, everything. It could work, right? It could. But I don't think it would work for very long. I think that someone else would come around with a smarter approach, a more creative approach, a more human approach that would make content, would make movies and TV shows that kind of like hit us in a different way, right? LLMs are great. I think AI is incredible, but it is at the end of the day an average of everything, right? It's not capable of certain things that humans are capable of doing, which is, I think, feeling emotion. Obviously, maybe this is debated in some esoteric circles. I don't think AI has consciousness. I don't think AI has feelings. I don't think that it knows what suffering is. I don't think it knows what love is. I don't think it knows what it feels like to have a child. I just don't. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, and there'll be a knock on my door from a robot who tells me that he knows what it's like to, I don't know, undergo surgery or have a kid. But for now, I think humans still have the market cornered on actual emotion. And so, I think that what I've seen is these firms that are able to endure, they use the tools, but the tools don't use them.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I like the humans have the market cornered on emotion. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
For better or worse. Yeah.
Yeah. But ultimately, we've talked about this a lot too. Ultimately, we're all in service of something, and really ultimately in service of each other. And if that's, the underlying truth, then it's hard to do that well without understanding the emotions that drive things. What you said about why you appreciate your wife's grandmother's painting, that would be very, 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 that would be possibly very easy to imitate, but extremely hard to understand and imitate or generate in a way that is actually very human, if that makes sense. Like the imperfections are what made it, and imperfections are sort of a very human thing. That the automation route is how do we take out imperfection, and a lot of what we've been saying for 20 minutes here is we're talking about the imperfections that are the stuff of life in a way. Let's go to Geneva. So one of the things I love about your work, and I've never seen anyone do this, but you open source your research. And so multiple people have joined you on research trips. I was fortunate and grateful to be one of those. So we went to the heart of mechanical watchmaking, Geneva, Switzerland. And we spent a couple days there, and we went to a watchmaking school, and we went to one of the most beautiful museums I've ever been to, and we actually made watches. So tell us about that. I mean, let's just start from the beginning. We're in Geneva. We go to a watchmaking school. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I suppose I'll start with, unlike you, I'm not particularly into watches. And I have a couple of old watches that were gifted to me from my uncle, and I respect them. But I never really understood why people were so into watches. It was kind of like, yeah, it's a nice watch, costs you a lot of money, but it's just a watch. I think what I saw at Patek and our time in the shops, time talking to people in the school, was kind of, again, what we're talking about, like this pursuit of something that's closer to art than it is mechanical function. And that, to me, is what has made these companies enduring. So if you go back to the quartz crisis, which is when the industry was really going through a period of turmoil because suddenly you no longer needed a mechanical watch, you could just have a battery-operated watch. These companies were really forced to consider their identity. What did they do? How did they do it? What value were they offering? Patek, I think, in particular, really leaned into the value of what they did was they were going to create the most extraordinary timepieces, no matter how long it took, no matter how much R&D it required, no matter how big of a failure it could be, but they were going to create absolute beautiful watches. And the gambit paid off. There's a lot of watch companies that haven't survived. And if you look at the sort of cemetery of watch companies, they're mostly populated by companies that grew big, the quality diluted, they scaled too fast, they became overly diversified, and then they died. They were able to extract profits for a significant period of time, but they lost relevance. No knock on Fossil, but, Fossil to me is a company that just is no longer that relevant. No one is quite particularly proud to own a Fossil. And what I think is so fundamental to watches in particular is, again, they are and they are not a commodity. Time itself, of course, you could just look at your phone, you get the time. But when you pursue a type of building an organization, growing an organization that transcends the product or service and offers something more meaningful to people, that's where you get into territory of being an enduring company. The famous slogan of Patek Philippe, which is, I'm going to butcher the exact phrasing, but it's effectively, you never own Patek, you merely take care of it for the next generation. I was fortunate to spend some time talking with the woman who helped create that campaign, and even in the words themselves, there were some distinctions that they made. It wasn't initially, it was going to be something like you don't own a Patek, you merely look after it for the next generation, and then they changed it to take care of, right? This idea of you take care of it. You don't just look after it, you take care of it. And that to me was the metaphor for the entire business itself, which is still owned by the Stern family. And it's a different mentality towards stewardship. Right?
Yeah,
and
very much.
I think that's the point.
I thought the line of that trip, for me at least, was when we had toured the watchmaking school, heard some incredible stories, including how some of the earlier successes in watchmaking, for example, what happened with Rolex, actually support the creation of the next generation of watchmakers. But a book that school had published, that the title translates into Respecting Tradition and Supporting Innovation. And I think we will probably spend the rest of our lives understanding what that balance is and what it means. But I thought that just summed it up so well. You can't have one. If you go too far either direction, you either become irrelevant or you sort of are a flash in the pan and fade away. But you need both to outlast. Yeah.
I mean, one of the challenges of writing this and researching it is conveying that I'm not a Luddite, right? I'm not someone who believes that keeping a process the same and never changing is good. I think that the world is far too dynamic, far too Cambrian to never change. And so I think what I'm trying to get at is precisely to your point is how do we keep things moving forward, but at a rate at which is sustainable, right? When you push things too fast, when you become too innovative, when you grow too fast. I mean, I'm spending a lot of time going back to a lot of the companies that I wrote about when I was still a reporter. I wrote for Inc. magazine, which really celebrated the fastest growing companies in America. And I look at those companies now, and most of them are gone, right? They had all the accolades, they had all the unicorn status, and then the magazine profiles and the cover stories. And there was a lot of, euphoria around these companies. They were the most innovative. They were the most bold. They grew the fastest. And then they died. And it's like, right? And it's like, and so what are we celebrating, right? And on the flip side, I think you walk through a lot of European and Japanese businesses and you realize like these are museums. They won't survive what's coming. They're not adapting. They're not evolving. They are too slow. In Portugal, I spent time and listened to a lecture and spent some time with an organization called the Hinokians. And the lecture was delivered by the former finance minister of Portugal. And he put up a chart that basically showed how little European companies invest into R&D and how far behind they are in AI, automation, machine learning, the rest of it. This is like an existential concern for European companies is, yes, we created something great, but the world has changed. How do we keep going? How do we keep this wealth? How do we keep this organization that was once maybe quite innovative, but now we have a lot more competition? The world has become more global. One of the owners that I've spent time with really forced me to consider this distinction of like an enduring company is not one that just stays small, but it's one that can become global. He's really into this idea of global, that in order to survive, you do have to grow. You do have to be global. You can't just be international, in his words, right? You can't just have a bunch of different outposts in different parts of the world. You can't be too scattered. It has to be cohesive. It has to be something that just becomes fundamentally part of the ecosystem in the industry that you serve. And so it circles back to honoring tradition while supporting innovation. I think that what I've also seen in more modern companies is it's almost like the attention spans are not just collapsing on a personal level, but on a company level, that companies chase things that maybe the market tells them they should be chasing or what management theorists say they should be chasing, but it often ends in disaster. Going back to my experience in media was going through a period of like intense turnover, crisis, turmoil. The business model was eroding. And so it was like being in an environment where strategy shifted just constantly. This week we're going to do video. Next week we're going to do short form. Next week we're going to do long form, and we're going to do podcasts. And it wasn't, in my experience, a particularly pleasant experience, because there were very few people in the industry that were kind of brave enough to just say, we're just going to do quality work, right?
Yeah.
And we're going to charge for this work.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that maybe is incredible about a lot of these businesses you're studying is there must have been periods where their sales were growing year after year after year, but there were also almost certainly in hundreds of years, periods where their sales are declining year after year after year. And I'm sure some of their survival story was they actually had conviction that if they serve the work well, if they keep making beautiful products or services, if they take care of their employees, et cetera, if they invest in their culture, that it will be okay. Which is the opposite in some ways of what you just described, which is sort of like we have to figure out what's new and popular or we become irrelevant. And then you sort of have no center. So talk to that. How do they kind of have a center? How do they figure out what it is? How do they have conviction even when times are bad that this is still a thing the world needs and we're going to keep making it? What have you seen like that?
Well, first of all, I'd say these companies have better balance sheets. They, they actually save
Hmm.
for the rainy day. You think about your own personal savings plan. It's like the number one rule, just set aside a year's worth of, shit happens budget. These companies do that. Most companies today are over leveraged and, there is no rainy day fund. They spend it on, not to knock buybacks or dividends, but we live in a Milton Friedman shareholder primacy world where profits are sent to shareholders and then the company is just kind of a skeleton and they become weak. When you have the benefit of, for sure, being privately owned, but even some publicly traded companies, when you have like a fortress of cash, then yeah, you can withstand a few years of a downturn. They intuitively know that. They plan ahead. They use those good periods to not just sort of like lavishly live the lifestyle and buy yachts, but sock it away. And so that's number one. And then number two, when the crisis does hit, and when a crisis hits a modern firm, one of the first thing that happens is, they fire people. Companies just lay people off. And that's just sort of accepted as this is how work is done. This is how the nature of capitalism must exist. What I'm finding, again, is very different. They'd rather sell machines, they'd rather sell buildings than lay off the people. It's, in their minds, easier to recalibrate when the downturn ends when you still have the people that know how to do the thing well and, figure out buying the building back later or get the new tool or spend time to just consolidate. And of course, this isn't, I'm not trying to paint a picture of the perfect organization that has never laid anyone off. These firms, of course, like fire people, lay people off, they go through cyclical downturns. But the underlying operating system, the philosophy is, in a time of crisis, their first thought is, we just need to lay everyone off. Their first thought is, what can we sell? Right? They have a different understanding of human capital than so many modern organizations. And again, I think I'm not arguing that these firms are better or worse. I'm simply saying that they are optimized for long-term survival. And
Yeah.
and that's the difference, right? It's a different approach to business. It's a different approach to capitalism altogether. It's one that I think most of modern management theory doesn't really claim should exist. I mean, I'm not going to get too into it because, I want to save some for the book, but I used to really lionize and believe in ideas around disruptive innovation, ideas around creative destruction. I'm no longer convinced that those are the only ways that the business world can operate. I think that there are different approaches. We just don't really look at them. They're not flashy. The companies I'm writing about are kind of boring. There's no scandal. They're not growing 80% a year. They're not building out AI infrastructure, but they're essential to the modern economy in many ways. These are not just like tea caddy shops. I'm writing about major industrial firms from John Deere to Corning, even companies like Barnes and Noble. I find fascinating. 150-year-old company that under a great new leader named James Daunt is emerging quite well in this new world where people have said bookstores should die. Well, they're actually doing better than they've ever done before. Why? What's happening there? Well, the culture's shifting. The theory is shifting. The way that they think about serving their customers is going back to what it was. So it was, when I think a lot of these companies that we see rise and then fall, I think it just creates this sort of negative, cynical view of business that this is just how the world works. And I suppose what I'm trying to offer in this project is a bit of hope that there's another way to do things, that it doesn't have to feel so extractive and brittle and fast moving, and the way that we approach our work doesn't need to feel the same way. And so, yeah, I kind of am now back in the world and reading stuff, and I'm like, none of this makes sense to me. And the things that you say are true, that we must move fast, we must break things. No, we don't. It's like,
Yeah.
if you want to make money in the market, these might not be the best theories to apply to your framework.
Yeah. Okay, here's one way we could interpret what you're finding. That businesses that have lasted for hundreds of years somehow found a product or service that is somewhat eternal in nature, meaning they found a thing that the world always needs, and whether through luck or skill or some combination, they make that thing, and then humans always need to buy it. Another way we could interpret it is, rather than they were skillful or lucky to find a thing that humans always needed, they actually were just very good at figuring out how to serve others well through whatever craft or discipline they interpreted or they practice. So speak a little bit to that. I imagine it's a blend, but I imagine you're probably seeing things that I would have never thought we lived in a world where a tea caddy shop would last that long, for example.
Yeah.
So, speak to that.
Yeah. I think that the counterpoint to what I'm saying is something like, in any random sample of things, there's going to be outliers. And this is statistical noise. And these are companies that just happen to be in an industry or a market where the product or service that they're offering hasn't changed, and that, they just benefit from monopolies or just being in a secular area that, it's just, they've always done wine, right? And people will just keep drinking wine. What I find interesting about that is that even the logic of that breaks down when you study these firms, because many of them started as something else completely, right? They didn't start out in, let's say, John Deere's case, as a tractor company. They did start out in farming. They made plows, but they weren't tractors. Tractors didn't exist. So that calls into question, like, this idea of, well, if you were selling horse-drawn carriages during the early 20th century, you were just going to go out of business. That's not totally true. A lot of these firms evolved through periods of creative destruction, through technological revolutions, through pandemics, through wars, through everything else. So I think that's, to me, perhaps one of the most fascinating parts is, not only did they survive these technological revolutions by fundamentally changing their product or service, in some cases going into entirely different industries altogether, but very often these firms are the ones leading that charge, right? The innovation is coming from the incumbent. And so you can get where I'm going, which is, this is where I think some of the theories that we've been inherited are maybe not wrong, but not totally right, and that's what I think is the thread worth pulling, right? So yes, there may be some of these, and again, I go back to, some of these firms are old yeller. They will die, right? The running joke of my project is, I'm going to come out with this book, and half the companies I write about will be dead by the time the book is published. I don't think that's true. I think it's possible. I think some companies that I've studied...
I would take the other, given that by definition, you're writing about ones that have lasted for hundreds of years. I think I'll take the other side of that bet.
It's an open question. As I was pursuing this research in the last couple of years, companies like Hudson Bay Company, a 400-year-old Canadian retailer, went bankrupt, right? So just because they're old doesn't make them de facto interesting to me. They have to embody the ethos and the practice of the traits that I've found along the way. I think, postmortems on these companies are very fascinating. And you can, we've all sort of looked at the Kodak case studies and GE. I'm, not interested to relitigate those. But I think that when you actually look at why, so the other part of, I think, what's obviously fascinating is, not only why companies endure, but why do companies fail, right? That is an impossible. I think one of the things I've kind of just settled on personally is, I'm not interested or capable of answering the why, but I am capable of answering the how, right? We both have young kids. We've been in the car ride and they're like, why? It's I don't know why the earth exists. Same thing about these companies. Why does this company fail? A million reasons. How they failed, I think, is actually more instructive. And same with how they survived, right? To me, it's not why they survived. I can't answer that for you. That no one can answer that. That's a question better for your clergyman. But how, I think, is a question that is answerable, right? And it's answerable by spending enough time really thinking about them, spending time with them, studying them. And that question of how is a question that can be applied to investing. It can be applied to entrepreneurship. it's a question that can be applied to your own career. Like if you study how these firms, these people did it, not so much why, you can't understand why, what motivates them, but how they did it, then you actually get into territory of useful information, like practical information. And
Yeah.
that's where I'm interested. Like that's where I think
Yeah.
I like to spend my time, because abstract theories, disruptive innovation, like these are theories. They're not practical in a way that's like, it will tell you what to do.
Right.
Um,
Right. Well,
so,
and in
so
some ways,
that's the ambition here.
this is the wisdom that we've, in some ways, modern culture has lost the tools of getting it. And all I mean by that is we, like on the Art of Quality podcast, we had several versions of this before it was a podcast, and it ended up being a podcast because we learned that stories seem to carry most of the wisdom in the world across generations, and we were trying to unconceal wisdom. And so we said, all right, well, I guess we have to go into storytelling, story keeping, story exploring mode, and a lot of history is verbal, so here we are. But that's, to your point, that is so different from, let me look at a whole lot of things and then tell you why something worked, which is probably a little more in vogue and probably has been a little more in vogue for, I don't know, the last generation or two, certainly, the last 100 years maybe. So I love that. So say more about how, maybe tease us a little bit with, so how are you kind of structuring a book around this? It sounds like some of it will come down to very practical stories full of wisdom, but say more.
Yeah, I guess I'm writing it. First, I've found really 8 things, 8 principles, right? 8 traits that these companies share. And it's not just that these 100-year-old plus companies share them. I think a lot of modern firms actually do share these. So if you were to expand your time horizon the next 500 years, there are certain companies today that will survive the next 500 years. So in my mind, these are all Outlastian firms too. They just haven't matured into that age yet. But the way I'm framing this book is I don't, like I have a busy life. I don't have time to read many books. I don't want my book to just be theoretical. I want it to actually help people think about the crises that they face in their life, the distraction that they have, how to create better cultures within their company, within their community, how to really think about where to find talent, how to think about where innovation comes from and how to employ it at your own firm. And then, going back to our question before around supporting innovation and honoring tradition, how to actually let go of things that are no longer working for you in your organization. The garden metaphor serves me well in that, these businesses are pruned. How do we prune our own lives? How do we prune our own businesses? How do we think about these cycles of growth and decay that are necessary for them to continue to evolve? If you grow really fast, every CEO or entrepreneur has experienced this, you end up with probably more than you need. And then you have to kind of cut it back. And then you have to let it grow. And then you have to cut it back. And so very few books speak to me on those levels. And so I'm just writing the book that I find helpful and that I want to read. If 10 people read it, Simon and Schuster, cover your ears. Like I'd be vastly more happy if like a few people read it and really learned from it than, it just like, gets touted as some book that's like about longevity and is important, but also doesn't actually change anything.
Yeah.
So
I mean, even that you're modeling the craft, right? You're serving the work.
That's the idea. I mean, I wouldn't, I'm sharing this with you because it's like, we're friends and I know this is public and, but I'm trying to take what I've learned and just put it in my own work. Like,
yeah,
I don't want to write a book that's a business card for, I want to do something that's quality, that's like real, that's authentic. That's something that my kids will read and my grandkids will read and hopefully my great grandkids, like something that in itself is Outlastian. Like that's the meta framework. And it's hard, it's hard to do things well. It's why I don't sleep well. It's why I, it's really hard. The hardness is good. If it wasn't hard, if it was easy, if anyone writes a book and says, oh, it's pretty easy, then it's not a good book. just like if anyone runs
Yeah.
a company and they're like, yeah, it's pretty easy to run this company. And it's like, then this
Yeah.
company is not going to last for a long time if it's too
Yeah.
easy.
Yeah.
But you also have to enjoy it. And like I am finding a deep satisfaction in the work, and you hinted at like I'm open sourcing it. It's like, yeah, I want to go to these places with my friends. I want to share this thing. I want to have fun with it. I don't want it to be this. I don't want to be a Thomas Edison and, have all these concoctions in a lab and, and then burn bridges all around me and be fiercely tribal over the work. I just kind of I want it to be fun. I want it to be good. And I, I want to show my kids that like, this is the pursuit that actually brings joy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful and makes me all the more excited to read the finished product. Where are your next trips? What's I think you said you're done for this year, but where are you going next year?
I'm going to Vegas, Nashville. I'm going to Amsterdam. I'm going to probably Belgium, back to Japan, Italy, Germany, a couple of other places. So
Goodness. Wow. So you're still I mean,
I'm on the road, man.
What you will have flown 1 million miles by the time you're done here.
I clocked 200,000 so far.
That makes me all the more excited. It's I can't imagine doing this well and thoroughly on less than 200,000 miles of flying.
Yeah, I know the whole thing sounds insane, and it is, and sometimes I wonder what the hell I'm doing. But I'm just I'm having fun with it. That's all I know, and hopefully the finished product is good, and we'll get off this call. I'm just gonna go back to trying to write it.
I love it. So what help are you looking for? And if people can help, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
I don't need, I just, I love to connect with people who are interested in similar subjects. I have a website, outlastbook.com. They can sign up for my newsletter where I occasionally share some field reports. Otherwise, I'm just kind of writing about what I'm reading. And that's it. I mean, I'll have more probably in the coming months, but I just really like you, and I enjoy having these conversations. I'm not doing much, in the way of like podcasts for the next few months. I'm just kind of heads down. I'm just kind of getting back into the work.
Yeah, I'll risk a risky question. When do you think the book will be out?
Well, I owe it to my editor, September of this year, and so the plan is to get it out in 2027.
That's awesome. Well, this won't be the last time we do Notes from the Field. So this was edition number 2, and based on your upcoming travel schedule, there'll be much more to talk about. Thank you for listening. For more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co.